The roast chicken smelled amazing, but I couldn't eat. I sat at the far end of my father's long dining table, surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who had driven in from 3 different cities for Sunday dinner. The chandelier above us was bright and warm. The conversation was loud. And my father, Warren Alcott, was standing at the head of the table holding a printed piece of paper like it was evidence in a courtroom. It was a printout of my old crowdfunding page. The one I had launched 4 years ago, before I figured out what I was really building. The campaign had raised exactly $1,100 before I shut it down and changed direction entirely. He waved it above his head and laughed. Not a quiet laugh. A full, chest-deep laugh that made his shoulders shake. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, spreading his arms wide like a showman, "I present to you the future of finance. My son Marcus and his little internet hobby." Everyone laughed. My Aunt Patricia covered her mouth. My cousin Derek nearly choked on his bread roll. Even my Uncle Raymond, who barely spoke at these dinners, was grinning. I kept my eyes on my plate. In the background, the television was on. A news channel, low volume. I wasn't paying attention to it yet. But I should have been. I had heard this kind of laughter before. The first time was 3 years ago, at this same table, with this same man sitting at the head of it. I had just quit my position as a junior analyst at Alcott Capital Group, my father's firm, to build my startup from a 1-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture and a laptop that overheated every 2 hours. Warren Alcott did not take it quietly. He told me, in front of my mother and 2 cousins who happened to be visiting, that I was embarrassing the family. That I was throwing away a career he had spent years building for me. That real money required real discipline, and clearly I had neither. He picked up the phone that evening and called every relative who had ever shown interest in my work. He told each one of them not to invest. Not a single dollar. He said I was chasing a fantasy and that supporting me would only encourage the behavior. Now, sitting here 3 years later, my cousin Derek leaned over and whispered in my ear. He smelled like the same cologne he had worn since high school. "Just apologize, man," he said. "Tell him you're thinking about going back to a regular job. It'll make tonight easier." I almost laughed out loud. Then my phone vibrated under the table. It was a message from my co-founder, Nadia. It said 4 words. "Turn the TV back on." I looked at my phone for exactly 1 second before I reached across the table and picked up the remote. My father raised his eyebrows, mid-sentence, clearly annoyed. He had been explaining to Uncle Raymond why the technology sector was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. I turned the volume up. The news anchor on screen was a woman in a dark blazer sitting behind a glass desk. The lower third of the screen showed a red breaking news banner. She was speaking quickly, the way anchors do when something big has just happened and they are still processing the details themselves. She said a major acquisition deal had just been confirmed. One of the largest tech buyouts of the quarter. The kind of deal, she said, that reminded investors why they should never underestimate a young founder with a clear vision. My father rolled his eyes from across the table. He reached for his wine glass. "The tech industry," he said to no one in particular, "is a bubble designed for children who never learned how compounding interest works." Uncle Raymond nodded slowly like this was the most intelligent thing he had ever heard. The anchor kept talking. She said the company behind the acquisition had been founded by a young entrepreneur who was once written off entirely by the people closest to them. My father laughed. Probably another kid who got lucky with someone else's money. Then the screen began showing the company logo. The logo filled the screen completely for about 3 seconds before they cut back to the anchor. But 3 seconds was enough. It was a clean design. Dark blue background, a white geometric symbol in the center that looked like a compass rose with one arm longer than the others. Underneath it, in simple white letters, the company name. North Axis Technologies. My cousin Derek put his fork down. He turned his head toward me slowly, the way people do when they are not sure if what they are seeing is real. "Wait," he said. "Isn't that the same name as your thing?" I didn't answer. I kept watching the screen. My father hadn't looked up yet. He was refilling his wine glass, listening but not watching. He still thought this was someone else's story. Someone else's company. Some other young founder with a lucky break and a flashy logo. He hadn't connected it to the sun sitting at the far end of his table. The anchor shuffled her papers and looked directly into the camera. She said that as part of the acquisition deal, North Axis Technologies had absorbed several investment portfolios and financial groups that had struggled to adapt to the shifting demands of the modern market. She began listing them. The anchor read each name clearly and slowly, the way reporters do when the information is dense and they want their audience to follow every word. The first two names meant nothing to most people in the room. They were regional investment groups from the Midwest that had been quietly shrinking for years. Then she read the third name. Alcott Capital Partners. It was the newer, rebranded version of my father's original firm. He had renamed it 2 years ago after a difficult merger that had cost him 3 of his senior partners. He didn't talk about it at family dinners. He never talked about anything that made him look like he was losing ground. I watched him from across the table. He was lifting his wine glass toward his mouth, and the name of his company reached him just as the glass touched his lips. He didn't drink. He just held it there. His smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded slowly, the way a light dims when the power is going out, gradually rather than all at once. First the corners of his mouth dropped. Then the brightness left his eyes. Then his jaw tightened. He set the glass down without taking a sip. Uncle Raymond looked at him. Aunt Patricia looked at him. Derek looked at him and then looked at me and then looked back at him. The whole table had gone quiet without anyone deciding to go quiet. The anchor wasn't finished talking. My father pushed his chair back slightly from the table and straightened his posture. It was something he always did when he felt challenged. Like sitting up straighter would make whatever was threatening him smaller. That has to be a coincidence, he said. His voice was flat. Careful. He was choosing each word the way you choose your steps when you're walking on ice and you don't want to fall. There are dozens of firms with similar names. Alcott isn't a unique word. Nobody at the table agreed with him out loud. But nobody disagreed either. The anchor kept talking. She said the acquisition was not just significant for its size, but for what it represented. A tech startup, built from the ground up without traditional institutional backing, had successfully absorbed an entire legacy investment group in a deal that financial analysts were already calling one of the most strategically precise moves of the year. She said the founder of North Axis Technologies would be appearing in a live interview momentarily to speak about the deal directly. My father stared at the screen. The wine glass sat untouched in front of him. I felt my phone vibrate again. It was Nadia sending a thumbs-up emoji followed by a single line of text. The embargo just lifted. You're about to be very famous, Marcus. I kept my face completely still. While the news channel showed a commercial break before the live interview, my mind went somewhere else entirely. It went back to a Thursday afternoon 3 years ago, when I sat in my father's office on the 14th floor of the Alcott Capital building and asked him, calmly and professionally, to consider a small seed investment in what would become North Axis. I had a deck. 42 slides. I had spent 11 nights building it. Every number was sourced. Every projection was conservative. I had practiced the pitch in front of my bathroom mirror until I could deliver it without looking at my notes. He listened for about 7 minutes before he interrupted me. He told me the business model was derivative. He said the market I was targeting was already saturated by companies with 10 times my resources. He told me that passion was not a substitute for experience and that I was proving, once again, that I had a talent for elaborate daydreaming. Then he called his assistant and had her set up a call with 2 relatives who he knew were considering putting money into my idea. He told them both, that same afternoon, that the venture was high risk with almost 0 probability of return. Both of them pulled back. I had walked out of that office with nothing. Not even the courtesy of a full hearing. The commercial break ended. The TV cut to a live interview setup. And behind the reporter standing outside with a microphone, I could see a building I recognized immediately. My Aunt Patricia leaned forward in her chair and squinted at the television screen the way people do when they need glasses but haven't admitted it yet. That building, she said, pointing her fork at the screen. Doesn't that look like the one Marcus was telling us about last Christmas? The one where he said his new office was. My father shifted in his seat. Startups rent cheap office space in the same business districts all over the city, he said quickly. It's a common architectural style. Means nothing. But his voice had changed slightly. It was still steady, but underneath it, something was working hard to stay calm. I had grown up with that voice. I knew the difference between Warren Alcott being confident and Warren Alcott managing his fear. Derek was looking at me now with wide eyes. He mouthed something across the table, but I couldn't read it. I looked away from him and back at the screen. The reporter outside was a young man in a grey jacket. He was holding his microphone close and speaking quickly into the camera. He said the story behind North Axis Technologies was not just a financial headline. It was, he said, a story about belief. About what happens when someone refuses to accept the version of themselves that other people have decided they should be. He said he was about to introduce the founder. He began describing who this person was. The reporter spoke in the practiced, confident tone of someone who had read the company's press release carefully and was now performing it for an audience. He said the founder had started with no institutional backing, no family money, no connections to the traditional investment world. My father snorted. That just means nobody serious believed in it from the start. Uncle Raymond nodded again. He had been nodding at everything my father said all evening like a slow, reliable metronome. The reporter continued. He said the founder had spent the early years of the company being rejected by every major venture capital group they approached. He said those rejections had not broken the vision. Instead, they had sharpened it. The company had grown not by following the standard path but by building a completely new one. Then the reporter said something that made the table go quiet again. He said the founder came from a family deeply embedded in the traditional investment world. A family, he said, that had been among the earliest and most vocal doubters of the entire enterprise. I felt the air in the room change. Several people turned slowly and looked at me. Not dramatically. Not with any noise. Just quietly, the way you turn your head toward a sound you weren't expecting to hear. My father did not turn. He stared at the screen and his jaw was tight. The reporter smiled into the camera and said the founder would be joining the interview remotely. The table was not completely silent yet, but it was getting there. The casual noise of a family dinner, the clinking of glasses, the overlapping conversations, the sound of chairs shifting, all of it had faded into a low hum that felt more like held breath than actual sound. My Aunt Patricia put her fork down. My Uncle Raymond stopped nodding. Derek had both hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself. My father cleared his throat. There are thousands of founders in this country, he said. His voice was still controlled, but it had lost its entertainment quality. He wasn't performing anymore. He was calculating. The fact that a few details sound familiar means absolutely nothing. This is a coincidence. He said the word coincidence the way people say it when they are hoping very hard that it's true. I didn't respond. I looked at my phone instead. There were 14 new messages in the North Axis Founders group chat. Nadia had sent a voice memo. 2 of our investors had sent congratulations. Our head of communications had sent a screenshot of a financial news website with our logo at the top of the page. And then my phone did something it had not done all evening. It rang. Not a text. Not a message. A full, loud, undeniable phone call. The name on the screen was Nadia Cole, my co-founder. I looked up from my phone and straight at my father. Then I answered it. Marcus. Nadia's voice came through the speaker clearly. She was laughing, but it was the kind of laughter that happens when something enormous has just become real and your body doesn't know how else to respond. Are you watching right now? Tell me you're watching. I'm watching, I said. My father leaned forward. Who is that? Marcus, we're at dinner. You know the rules about phones at the table. I held up one finger. Just one. The way he had held up one finger to silence me 100 times during my childhood when I tried to speak while he was on an important call. He stared at that finger like he couldn't believe he was seeing it. They want you live in about 2 minutes, Nadia said. The producer already confirmed your connection. Just switch to the video call when they patch you in. Your background looks fine. I already checked the camera settings remotely. I'm not at the office, I said. There was a brief pause on her end. "Where are you?" "Sunday dinner," I said quietly. "At my father's house." Another pause. "Oh," she said. And then, softer, "Oh, Marcus." In the background of her call, I could hear the controlled noise of a newsroom waiting. Producers talking into headsets. A countdown beginning. "You're live in 30 seconds, the producer's voice said clearly through Nadia's phone. The North Axis acquisition deal had been finalized on a Wednesday, 4 days before this dinner. We had signed the last documents at 11:40 in the morning in a conference room on the 8th floor of our building, with our legal team, 2 representatives from Alcott Capital Partners, and 3 of our lead investors sitting around a long table covered in paper. The representatives from Alcott Capital had not known who I was. That was intentional. Nadia and I had structured the entire negotiation through our legal team and through a holding company we had set up 18 months earlier for exactly this purpose. We had kept my name completely out of the visible paperwork until the final signing. When I walked into that conference room and the Alcott representatives saw my face, one of them recognized me immediately. He had worked for my father for 6 years. His name was Philip, and I remembered him from the days when I used to bring my father lunch at the office as a teenager. Philip had looked at me for a long moment and then looked at the documents in front of him. Then he had signed his name. He hadn't said a word to me. He didn't need to. The press embargo had been set to lift at exactly 8 in the evening on Sunday. Our communications team had chosen the timing deliberately. Peak viewing hours. Maximum impact. I had known about the dinner. I had come anyway. Now my phone screen showed a video call connecting. And the producer's voice said, "You are live." The television screen switched from the reporter outside to a split screen. On the left side was the anchor at her desk. On the right side was my face. My face, on my father's television, in my father's dining room, where 60 seconds ago he had been waving a printout of my failed crowdfunding page and laughing. I was wearing the same shirt I had worn to dinner. Dark green, slightly wrinkled at the collar. Not the kind of shirt a person wears when they expect to be on national television. I had not dressed for this. I had dressed for a family dinner where I expected to be mocked. The room behind me was the small sitting room off the hallway, where I had slipped away when the call came in. The anchor smiled and said good evening. She said it was a pleasure to speak with the founder of North Axis Technologies on what she called one of the most surprising evenings in recent investment news. I said good evening back. My voice was calm. It surprised me how calm I sounded. The dining room behind the half-open door was completely silent. I knew they were all watching. I could feel it. 23 years of knowing when my father was in the same room as me had given me a sensitivity to his presence that I had never been able to turn off. The anchor leaned forward slightly and said the question everyone wanted answered. She asked me what my company had just acquired. I heard the words come out of her mouth and land in the room like something physical. The anchor listed the acquisitions clearly and methodically, the same way she had done before but with more detail now, more context, more weight behind each name. Alcott Capital Partners was third on the list again. She said the firm had been operating under increasing financial pressure for 2 years and that the acquisition by North Axis Technologies represented a full structural absorption of its assets, client portfolios, and operational infrastructure. In the dining room, through the half-open door, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. I knew it was my father standing up. The anchor then turned to me and said that what made this story remarkable was not just the numbers. She said what made it remarkable was the personal dimension. She said she understood, based on the information provided by our communications team, that this acquisition had an unusual background. She asked me to explain. The dining room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I looked directly into my phone camera. I thought about 11 nights building a pitch deck. I thought about a Thursday afternoon on the 14th floor. I thought about my mother's face when I told her I was leaving the firm to build something of my own. Then I spoke. North Axis started from a very simple place, I said. I had an idea that I believed in completely. Not because someone told me it was good. Actually, the opposite happened. The people I most expected to support me told me it was worthless. I paused for exactly 1 second. The kind of pause that lets a sentence breathe. That rejection did something I didn't expect, I continued. It removed every safety net I thought I had. And when all the safety nets are gone, you either fall or you find out you can fly. I decided to find out. The anchor nodded. She said the story resonated with a lot of young entrepreneurs who felt unseen by the traditional investment world. It's more than feeling unseen, I said. It's being told, directly, by someone who should know your capabilities better than anyone, that you don't have what it takes. That kind of thing doesn't just discourage you. It either destroys you or it builds you into something that person never imagined. In the dining room, I heard someone exhale. It might have been Aunt Patricia. It might have been Derek. I couldn't tell. My father said nothing. But I knew he was listening to every single word, matching each sentence to a memory, recognizing the story even though I had not mentioned his name once. The anchor thanked me for that and then asked her next question. She asked about the acquisition target. I explained that our technology platform had spent 18 months scanning the market for what we called structurally undervalued portfolios. Firms and groups that had strong legacy assets and existing client relationships but had failed to adapt to how the financial world was changing. Places where the foundation was solid but the thinking on top of it had grown rigid. I said our algorithm was particularly good at identifying investment groups that had dismissed technology-driven approaches too early and too completely. The ones that had called the tech sector a bubble while the bubble kept expanding. The ones that had backed away from innovation and told themselves it was wisdom when it was actually fear. I kept my voice professional. I kept it clean. But every person in that dining room who knew Warren Alcott understood exactly what I was describing. I said the largest single target in our acquisition sweep had been a firm that fit every one of those criteria precisely. Strong historical reputation. Loyal older client base. But a leadership philosophy that had stopped evolving at least 6 years ago. A firm that had missed 3 major market shifts in a row while insisting that the traditional approach was superior. I said our restructuring plan would preserve the client relationships that had genuine value while rebuilding the strategic framework from the ground up. Through the door, I heard my father's voice, very low, say the name of his firm out loud to himself. Like he was confirming something he had hoped wasn't true. The dining room erupted in a way that had nothing to do with celebration. Chairs moved. Voices overlapped. Someone dropped a fork. I heard my father say, loudly, "That is not possible. The contracts were handled through a third party. No one told me the buyer was." He stopped himself. I stayed on camera. The anchor was asking a follow-up question, but I could hear my father through the wall pulling his phone out and dialing someone. His voice got tight and clipped the way it always did when things were moving faster than he could control them. "Call me back immediately," he said into the phone. "This is urgent." He tried a second number. Then a third. None of them answered. It was Sunday evening. The deal had been signed Wednesday. The transition agreements, I knew, had been delivered to every relevant party by Friday afternoon. My legal team had been thorough. They were always thorough. Nadia sent me a text while the anchor was still talking. It said, "They're already signing the transition agreements." Philip confirmed. "Everything is moving." I read the message without changing my expression. Years of watching my father conduct high-pressure negotiations at family functions had taught me how to keep my face neutral when my mind was racing. The anchor asked me about the future structure of the company. The anchor laid out the numbers carefully, the way financial journalists do when they want their audience to grasp the scale of something without feeling overwhelmed by it. She talked about the acquisition price. She talked about the restructuring timeline. She talked about what it meant for clients and employees of the absorbed firms. I answered each question directly. I had rehearsed this part with our communications team on Friday morning. I knew exactly what I was allowed to say and what was still under legal review. What I saw, out of the corner of my eye, through the gap in the door, was my father sitting back down. Slowly. The way a man sits down when his legs have decided they are done holding him up. He was staring at the television. Not at me through the door. At the television, where my face was still on screen and the anchor was still asking me questions. I think that was the moment it truly became real for him. Not when he heard the company name. Not when the reporter described the acquisition. But when he saw his son, the one he had mocked an hour ago with a printed page of evidence, sitting calmly on a national news broadcast explaining how his firm had been absorbed, there was no argument he could make to a television screen. There was no relative he could look at for agreement. There was just the screen, and my face on it, and the numbers the anchor kept reading aloud. She asked me about future leadership. I told the anchor that one of the things North Axis had always believed was that the right people in the right roles could transform any organization. I said the acquisition was not about dismantling what had been built. It was about redirecting it. I said we planned to retain the majority of employees across all acquired firms. The analysts, the junior staff, the operational teams, those people had skills and client knowledge that were genuinely valuable. The restructuring was not aimed at them. I said leadership, however, was a different conversation. I said that the people who had guided these firms into the positions they were currently in, the people whose decisions had resulted in 3 consecutive years of declining performance, those individuals would need to demonstrate a real capacity for growth before any leadership roles could be confirmed. Through the door, I heard nothing. That silence was louder than everything that had come before it. Uncle Raymond coughed quietly. The refrigerator kept humming. Someone, I thought it might be Derek, pushed back from the table. The anchor nodded and made a note on her pad. She said it sounded like a forward-looking approach. Then she looked up from her notes and asked the question I had known was coming. The one that our communications team had not planted, but that any good journalist would arrive at naturally given everything that had already been said. She asked specifically about the current head of Alcott Capital Partners. The anchor asked the question and the room behind the door went absolutely still. Not the kind of still that happens when people are distracted. The kind of still that happens when everyone is paying the most careful attention they have ever paid to anything. She asked whether the current leadership of the acquired firm, specifically the founding partner, would retain any role in the restructured organization. Everyone in that dining room knew who the founding partner was. They had spent the last 6 hours eating his food and laughing at his jokes and nodding along to his opinions about the tech sector being a bubble for children. I let the question sit for a moment. Not because I didn't know the answer. I had known the answer for weeks. Nadia and I had discussed it thoroughly. Our board had weighed in. Our legal team had reviewed the implications. I let it sit because I had spent 3 years being cut off before I could finish a sentence at this table. I had spent 3 years being handed a single finger that meant wait, be quiet, you don't understand how this works yet. I wanted one moment where the silence was mine. Everyone was looking at the door. Some were looking at the television. My father, I knew without seeing him, was doing both. I looked into the camera. I answered. Every leadership decision we make will come down to one question, I said. Does this person believe in where we're going? Not where we've been. Not what worked 15 years ago. Where we are going right now and where we intend to be 5 years from now. I kept my voice even. No edge in it. No satisfaction. Just the clean, plain language of someone stating a policy. People who built things from scratch have a certain kind of toughness, I said. I respect that. But building something and then refusing to let it grow because growth feels unfamiliar, that's not strength. That's something else. And we don't have room for it. The anchor nodded slowly. Those who once dismissed innovation, I said, will find the transition genuinely difficult. I won't pretend otherwise. But the door isn't closed. It never is. What matters is whether someone can walk through it without their ego getting in the way. Through the door, I heard a sound I had not heard from my father in years. It was not loud. It was barely audible. It was the sound of a man exhaling everything he had been holding in his chest for the last 20 minutes. He didn't say a word. The anchor thanked me warmly. She told her audience that Marcus Alcott, founder and CEO of North Axis Technologies, had just completed one of the most remarkable acquisition announcements in recent memory. She congratulated me. The interview ended. I sat in the small side room for a moment after the call disconnected. The phone screen went dark. The noise from the newsroom disappeared. The only sounds were the ones coming from the other side of the half-open door. Plates shifting. A glass being set down. Someone, it sounded like Aunt Patricia, saying something very quietly that I couldn't quite make out. And then nothing. A silence so complete it felt like the house itself had decided to stop breathing. I stood up. I straightened my shirt, the wrinkled green one I had not dressed carefully enough for the evening I apparently walked into. Then I pushed the door open and walked back into the dining room. The table looked exactly as I had left it. The chicken, mostly eaten. The bread rolls, scattered. The wine glasses, some full, some empty. The centerpiece of white flowers my father's housekeeper had arranged that morning, sitting in the middle of everything like nothing unusual had happened. But the people around it had changed completely. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was nodding. Nobody was looking at my father for guidance or agreement. They were all looking at me. My father was sitting at the head of the table, both hands flat on the surface, his phone face down in front of him. He was staring at the television, which had moved on to another story. Then he turned and looked at me. "You planned this," he said. It was not a question. I pulled out my chair and sat down. I picked up my fork. The chicken was cold by now, but I took a bite anyway, because I had barely eaten all evening and because sitting down and eating felt like exactly the right thing to do. "The acquisition wasn't personal," I said. "We identified undervalued portfolios with strong client bases and weak leadership structures. Alcott Capital Partners met every criterion on our list. It was a business decision." He stared at me. "But," I said, and I kept my voice completely level, the irony was not lost on me. "You spent 3 years telling everyone who would listen that my idea was worthless. You called the investors who might have helped us and told them to stay away. You sat at this table and laughed at a crowdfunding page like it was proof that I didn't know anything." I looked at him directly. "Now my company controls every asset you spent 30 years building. I didn't plan for it to happen this way. But it did. And I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve the version of events where I pretend this is purely coincidental." The table was absolutely still. Derek had his eyes on his plate. Aunt Patricia had both hands folded in her lap. My father looked at me for a long time. His face did something complicated that I couldn't fully name. Then he asked, very quietly, whether he still had a place in the company. I set my fork down. I took a breath. I thought about how to say what I needed to say in a way that was true without being cruel, direct without being theatrical. "That depends entirely on you," I said. "North Axis values capability. It values people who can learn and adapt and admit when they were wrong. It does not value titles or reputations or the idea that seniority automatically means authority." He was watching me carefully. "If you can sit across from the team that built this company and actually listen to them," I said, "and if you can contribute the things you genuinely know about client relationships and legacy portfolio management, then yes. There might be a role. A real one, with real responsibility." I paused. "But it won't be at the top," I said. "That position is filled. And it won't come with the assumption that your opinion ends every conversation. It will come with the expectation that you're one voice among many, and that the voices of people who are younger and newer and less experienced than you might sometimes be the right voices to follow." He was quiet for a very long time. I let him be quiet. I had learned patience from years of being interrupted. Finally, he gave one small, slow nod. Not confident. Not certain. Just the nod of someone who had run out of arguments and was standing at the edge of something new, trying to decide whether to step forward. I picked my fork back up and finished my dinner. 6 weeks later, North Axis Technologies issued its official restructuring announcement. Every major financial outlet covered it. The headline numbers were impressive enough: the client retention rate, the operational integration timeline, the first quarter projections for the combined entity. But the detail that most reporters chose to lead with was the human story underneath the numbers. A founder who had been mocked and dismissed and actively undermined by the traditional investment world had built something that quietly, methodically, and legally absorbed the very institution that had dismissed him. No drama. No public confrontation. Just the slow, steady work of building something real over 3 years and then letting the results speak. Nadia sent me a bottle of sparkling water with a bow on it as a joke, because I didn't drink, and because she said it was the most Marcus Alcott way to celebrate anything. My mother called me twice. The second time, she cried a little. I didn't mind. My father joined the North Axis Transition Advisory Team in a limited capacity 6 weeks after the acquisition. He attended his first team meeting on a Tuesday morning, sat in a chair that was not at the head of the table, and listened for 90 minutes without interrupting anyone. Nadia texted me afterward with a single word. Progress. The next family Sunday dinner was at my mother's house. Smaller. Quieter. No television on in the background. When one of the younger cousins asked what I did for work, my father looked up from his plate. He didn't hesitate. He didn't redirect the conversation or add a qualifier or reach for something to soften the truth. He just said, "My kid runs the company that changed everything." And for the first time in a very long time, we were both telling the same story.